Each of our panelists will speak for about 5 minutes on the various reports that they've worked on in the European context, in Canada and the US. And then we will have a sort of roundtable of questions that they will sort of engage, and then we'll open it up for you to chime in with your questions as well. So I want to invite up Dr. Farid Hafez to talk to us about the European Islamophobia report. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everybody to make this possible today. Can you hear me?
No.
Oh, now you should hear me.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you again for everybody who made this possible today and for coming up with this to talk and exchange ideas and thoughts. So basically, I started my journey to study Islamophobia back then with my PhD, and following the PhD, I established a yearbook, which was kind of an academic journal, the Islamophobia Studies Yearbook in 2010, which back then was solidly German-speaking, Jahrbuch für Islamophobie-Forschung, and turned it into a bilingual journal in 2015. And at one point, a friend of mine who used to study with me and who meanwhile went back to his home country, Turkey, or Turkey as it is called these days, right? And said, hey, is there any way how we can help you? And I said, yeah, sure. Well, let's take this to the next level. And one of the things that I had experienced when I was traveling within the European continent was that a lot of the Muslim civil society organizations, as well as anti-racist organizations, faced challenges when they were talking to policymakers for doing something about the problem of Islamophobia. So I told him, you know what we need? We actually, because there have been like 2-3 reports commissioned even by institutions that are part of the European Union, first and foremost FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, back then was UNC, that some, every 10 years they did some kind of report, very often quantitative, but that was not enough really for giving the boost to those organizations to really push for demands. So I said, okay, let's do something where we will annually monitor the state of Islamophobia in Europe. So we came up, and I think we started with 25 countries or so, a group of 40 academics and NGO activists who did reports, basically 30 reports on each and every country, what happens from January 1st to December 31st, each and every. So you can see here, by the way, the website of our report, where you can download all of them free of charge, islamophobiareport.com. And what was important for us was that we speak to an audience, first and foremost, to help, as I said, Muslim civil society organizations and anti-racist organizations, but also to directly address policymakers. So if you look into those reports, basically all are structured very much the same way. So we look at hate crime, we look at the labor market, we look at media discourse, we look at political developments, we look at the justice system. So a number of things that each and every reporter is dedicated to analyze. And we end basically each and every report with a list of recommendations, first and foremost to the civil society, but also to the policymakers. So a lot of the audience for us was from the very beginning on the European Parliament, the European Council. At some points we were different venues of the United Nations, the OSCE and other supranational organizations, in order to bring to voice the critique of Islamophobia in these venues. And if you go through them, I mean, you will see that the covers have changed in a way that maybe the first report back in 2015 was a very anonymous one in the sense of, not depicting any specific object, but it turned more and more to the heads of states, first and foremost of Emmanuel Macron. It was the first that we put there, but also then my very own Austrian Chancellor, who is actually currently not anymore in power, Sebastian Kurz. But that also tells us like the story of where the problem of Islamophobia really moved, like at the center of the power structures. From more or less, let's say, if we talk about Germany, the streets, the AFD or anti-Pegida movements, etc., in 2014-15. Yeah, that's kind of, I think, I mean, there is a lot of what I could talk about, and I think we're going to have several rounds of deliberations, but looking back, I mean, we were not so much interested, and we definitely also had not the capacity to do any kind of quantitative work, and we saw also like other institutions like FRA would do that kind of job. But what we saw that as a form of success in a way is, I think, starting from the denial of Islamophobia in 2014-15 when we started this work, to coming to a point where last year we had the United Nations accepting a resolution a day to combat Islamophobia. I think there is a journey that has been made. And I mean, the OIC, which suggested this resolution, was also one of the many venues where we had participated. So I think there is something that we have achieved. Still, there is a lot to do, but with all the challenges given, I think there are minor and major steps that we have made throughout that travel within the last 9 years. All right, and I know that I already exceeded my 5 minutes. So let's start.
Thank you, Dr. Farid.
So the report that I'm going to talk about today is a study that I did on the Canadian Islamophobia industry, mapping Islamophobia's ecosystem in the Great White North. And this was in partnership with the Islamophobia Studies Center and the Islamophobia Research and Development Project. And this project began actually around 2017 when I was approached by the British Leadership at Georgetown after the Quebec mosque shooting to put together some fact sheets on Islamophobia in Canada. And so with the team of research assistants that I had working with me at my university, with Laurier University, we started to look at different individuals, groups, players that were promoting Islamophobia, that were the Islamophobia influencers, as well as looking at specific issues like the Quebec mosque shooting, looking at stilling the polls in Canada, public opinion polls for the last 20 years to look at what that told us about Canadians' views about Muslims. And we looked at different figures and people who were very active as Islamophobia propagators. And in the process of doing that, we realized that we were actually starting to see some networks, some patterns, some connections that warranted further investigation. So, I applied for a research grant and we decided to dig a little deeper into those connections. And so the study identified how Islamophobia in Canada is organized, orchestrated, networked, and monetized. And of course, most of the studies done on the Islamophobia industry have been done here in the US. And influential studies like Fear Inc. and Hijacked by Hate, Nathan Leeds' book on the Islamophobia industry, were the first to identify the coordinated and monetized nature of Islamophobia and identify the key players behind it. So I've often said what is distinctive about Islamophobia as a form of oppression, as opposed to other forms of oppression, is that there is an industry behind its promotion that is purveying 24/7 anti-Islam. So my study is the first attempt to map the industry in Canada and look at the different players that are involved in Islamophobic networks look at some of the ideas that they are promoting, the ideologies they're promoting, the connections they have, and where possible, trying to trace some of the money trail, although we're not able to do that in Canada in the same way as they are able in the United States because we don't have access to tax records, but we were able to find some links between Islamophobia organizations in the US and connect them to Canada. And so it was the first of its kind. It took about 4 years to do. It is a 250-page, very detailed report that has 100 pages of separately archived media sources that are referenced and hyperlinked in that report. So it's very rigorously cited, and that is necessary in doing this kind of work. So when we talk about what the Islamophobia industry is, it's comprised of media outlets, political figures, far-right white nationalist groups, and Islamophobia influencers, and ideologues, pro-Israel fringe right groups, Muslim dissidents, think tanks, security experts, and the donors who fund these campaigns. And so all of these individuals and groups and institutions comprise a network that supports and engages in activities that demonize and marginalize Islam and Muslims in Canada. So the objective of this study was to map those political, ideological, institutional, and economic networks that foment Islamophobic fear and moral panic in Canada. And I've already referenced the very deadly consequences of that in Canada. And then to examine the strategies that are employed by Islamophobia agents and highlight the ties among the players in the Islamophobia industry. And also to create key profiles of public figures, media outlets, organizations to produce and distribute Islamophobic ideologies and propaganda. And then finally, to identify the dominant Islamophobic discourses and conspiracy theories that circulate through these networks. And we used, in the beginning, we began with a lot of Post-it notes on the wall, as I recall, and we kept trying to move them around and see, what was there a central kind of figure in this? And so we did played around with that for a while, and as we started to get deeper into the analysis, we used social network theory and social network analysis as a way to identify the nodes and ties and connections between various players within the groups and the spheres of influence that they have. So it was important to elevate the study of Islamophobia industries and place them within a social science, analytical, and methodological framework. So let me just say quickly, when we talk about organized Islamophobia, just who some of the players are in Canada. So I'll just mention 5 groups. And I really resisted calling them the 5 pillars of the industry. But far-right media and Islamophobia influencers in Canada, we have Rebel Media, which is one of the main promoters of far-right discourse and central to that echo chamber. And they have birthed several Islamophobia influencers, like Faithful, Leorian Southern, who are prominent in Canada, Ezra Levant being the figurehead of this group. And now there are some newer media outlets that have also come out to follow suit. Another group that we looked at were what we call the foot soldiers of Islamophobia, and that was the far-right white nationalist and neo-Nazi groups and agitators behind them who were active in promoting anti-Muslim hate online and through public protests and demonstrations. Excuse me. So they are part of a wider constellation of white nationalist groups in Canada, and there are about 300 of different sizes and stripes and different kinds of influence. Within that, we profiled about 30 in the report whose main sort of raison d'etre, their main kind of purpose was to promote anti-Muslim campaigns. In addition to the foot soldiers, there was another category that we saw as the soft power groups behind the industry, and they leverage influence by promoting anti-Muslim campaigns to achieve specific political, ideological goals that drive Islamophobic subcultures. And they do this under the guise of promoting democracy, human rights, speech, Judeo-Christian values, ideals to which they deem Islam and Muslims as being antithetical and incompatible. So soft power groups use tactics like bullying, harassment, and intimidation, And most of these soft power brokers are groups that we categorize as pro-Israel fringe right groups. The other category that we looked at were the native informers, and so these are the Muslim dissidents and ex-Muslims who play the role of authoritative interlocutors, creating and validating Islamophobic narratives and conspiracy theories, and they provided, as insiders, the political cover for Islamophobic campaigns. And then there were think tanks and their designated security experts who create a cult of expertise to promote Islamophobic conspiracy theories that brand Muslims as potential radicals and threats to national security and so on. And that has resulted in Muslim groups and organizations and charities being singled out for undue scrutiny for racial and religious profiling. And so those are the main kind of main groups that comprise the Islamophobic industry. And you know, our project was to look at who were the major players, the connections between them, and the kind of ideas that they are promoting as part of these Islamophobic campaigns. So I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Jasmin. Dr. Elsadig will help us with understanding more or give us some background demographics on the, I can't remember the exact title of your Islamophobia through the eyes of Muslims, assessing perceptions, experiences, and impacts in the US context.
Thank you, Munir. Hello, everybody. Coming to you from the other Employee Institute, which is one building that traveled so far. I'm really pleased to be here with my colleague. I've been working with them for years. I learned from them to craft this career. Seriously, not joking. I learned from those people. We've been working with Islamophobia in our institute for quite some time. And our institute preoccupied by the idea that othering, discrimination, misapplies, structural racism, all built into a system. So you can study phenomena based on individual actions. So for us, we can define our name to suggest that all communities grant to belonging, but infrastructure for belonging are not there. But yet, system and infrastructure of othering are umbrella around us. So we started our work to advocate to hold the US government accountable to the United Nations. That's one of our first work to do, to look outside. United States signed in multiple international treaties that they're supposed to treat everybody equally and justly, especially in terms of freedom of religion, expression, and the freedom of the US institutions. So we've been just going to New York, going to Geneva, and writing those kind of reports, which covered reads, except experts sitting in closed room. But we've been able to put a lot of pressure in the US State Department in the way in which laws in the US are being crafted when they are discriminating against Muslims. But in that kind of journey, we discovered that the most Islamophobic tendencies in the United States are actually inhabited, not in the federal government, but rather in the state legislature. So we came back and we designed a different type of research. It's to build the first database ever existed in the US to monitor only all laws proposed, failed or passed, or enacted into law within state legislation. And to our surprises, we find very strange things. One, that Islamophobia is one of the expressions of structural racism itself. How so? So when we look back, our assumption was that because of 9/11 tragedy, there is certain attack against Muslims within the Israeli boundaries, right? That's wasn't true at all. At all. It's almost zero. In the federal government, yes. In the state legislature, almost zero. The first plethora of legislations being proposed was after the election of Barack Obama. So we wonder what it has to do with this. But if you all recall that, as Hanti Badian remind us, they couldn't call him the N-word, so they called him the N-word, right? So, and that in itself generates this kind of put baked into the system of implicit bias, discriminatory prejudice, and outright racism. So I've been preoccupied by looking at the law and the policy formation rather than, the tremendous amount of work other people do, which is extremely valuable, is to monitor everything being acted, whether in communities or for individual or in a courtroom. So, and the reason behind that is because we discovered there is a huge gap when we engage with policymakers. We couldn't provide evidence. I mean, we can provide anecdotal evidence. So we decided to do research. So we built a first database. We managed it since 2017 till today. We are updated annually in February. You can go to our website, other than Belonging or Berkeley, and you will find it there. It's available to the public. We screen every single law and give you the detail about the law and where is it and who behind it and who's the group behind it or who supports it, the whole 9 yards. And after that, we came back and we decided, wait a second, but we never asked Muslims Americans themselves about this. Where is the voice of Muslim Americans? Every study we find, good or bad, is somebody else. So myself and my Muslim colleagues, Muslim American colleagues, we sat down, she is a she, and we decided only us, we're gonna write about this. Only us, we're gonna define the instrument of surveying every single Muslim if we can in the United States. And the inspiration was Dalia's work that Who Speaks for Islam is that we need to figure out a way we can be working in our cases. So the first question for us in the survey was, is Islamophobia existing in the Muslims' eyes? What is their perceptions? How do they understand it? Do they see it in relation to other system of othering, mechanism of othering, bias, prejudice, discrimination, racial, what have you? Another thing, by doing that, we tried to eliminate the diversity of Muslims Americans themselves. Who those people are? We all suffer from how Islam and Muslim are monolithic things everywhere, in every part of the world. So we try to pinpoint that we as a people also have a diverse backgrounds in all aspects of life. Some of us born here, some of us are here since the inception of the nation, some of them just came yesterday. So to make sure that actually the public understand, and Muslims themselves to understand that our story is bigger than just a single story by a few bad apples here and there, or a few politician groups suggest. So we designed this research, this survey. We ran it prior to the election of 2020 for a reason. And we disseminated throughout the United States in 50 states and the District of Columbia. We got a very sizable number of people participated, and the margin of error was 2.9, which for us was very satisfactory. And the discovery through that, it was some of it confirmed what we knew. Some of them shocked us, make us really sad of the reality of how Muslims feel about themselves, for example. So we decided to make this sure, and we published this report, and I really invite you to look at it. It's on our website, you can download it. And the information in it is timely, because you could see we try to avoid measuring things that we get all by the time. But we try to get into the perception. What is it, how Muslims feel, how they think, where they are, where they live, where they located, in terms of the state, right? Where is the majority are, and what the fundamental thing that they wanted is what the policy proposals are. They thought suitable to provide example. It's a list of things, and I'm not going to get into it, but I will be happy to discuss it in the Q&A. Thank you.
just want to thank you all for just giving us a glimpse into the reports. And please, they're available. You can go online and read them more fully. It's of course painstaking work. It's highly risky work in any context, of course, and also it's really important after the years of the database also to sort of start thinking about Muslim voices ourselves, and I think how is this affecting our diverse communities as well. So, someone you want to add anything to this point, or you want to
Firstly, I mean, just encourage everyone to read the reports because these are actually very valuable. I think they're valuable in two main ways. Firstly, it's a bit like looking like a painting. If you really look very closely to the painting, all you'll see is dots. And many times the experience of Islamophobia or other forms of racism that are completely individualized. You cannot even understand what you're actually experiencing when this comes across in many different ways. So you have to be able to find yourself at the right distance to see the whole picture. And I think that's the first important thing, that really without reports like this, you don't see the whole picture. And you end up doing two things. Either you simply dismiss it as some sort of individualized misfortune, or you see it so localized that it doesn't mean anything, it has no significance. And I think one of the first, the Islamophobia studies has been going on for at least probably about 20 years. And I think we can sort of narrate three main phases. The first one has really been the idea of kind of the recognition of the systematicity by which Muslimness was targeted. And that, in a sense, emerges even before the kind of campaign for Islamophobia, because in a sense, Islamophobia refers to the fact there's a recognition of something systematic going on. And there was a contest around that just to demonstrate to people that something systematic meant, well, the first thing was, well, how do you make systematic? It could be many other factors. There's no report, there's no data. The entire apparatus of a modern state, which works on particular ways of making things legible, how you count things, how you present things in a particular format, that did not exist. And without that, Islamophobia did not exist. And therefore those experiences did not exist in any particular form, except anecdotal experiences of what happened to me, etc., etc. And related to that was always different factors, but it's not really Islamophobia, it was something else, and there's always a displacement into other causal factors, which are easy to deal with. I don't know what the experience is like here, but in general, you'll find that whenever you talk about racism in a mixed gathering, there can be a degree of discomfort, and someone will raise their hand and say, let's not talk about race, but what about class? And that's simply a way of disgracing the category of race to something which is much more comfortable, which is in those sort of settings, and especially in universities, which are fundamentally white spaces. Whether they are in Argentina or they're in Africa, they remain white spaces. So in a sense, that's the second thing. So the second phase, really, apart from systematicity, was really the kind of contest around understanding Islamophobia as something that happens to communities. But these communities were always contained within the kind of nation state, within local communities. It's basically what happens to minorities. And the idea of Islamophobia was really a minority infection. And again, you can see that in the early reports that you have really about talking about immigrant minorities or other ethnically marginalized minorities, and it became part of that sort of framework for that. The third phase, and I think this comes out of the work that's been done both with Jasmin and Farid, is that we're having to see Islamophobia beyond the national state framing. And that's both a kind of an empirical exercise, because the industry that you described in Canada has a great deal of overlaps in personnel and funding and resources and groups with the industry as a global entity. Similarly with Europe, you can see there's a different kinds of mixing going on there. But it's also a methodological break, because the entire social sciences are predicated on the idea that the unit of analysis is always the nation state. That's why you have so many studies basically looking at nation states. And when something like Islamophobia transcends that, you have a tendency to say, well, Islamophobia in France is very different than Islamophobia in the Czech Republic, or it's very different than Islamophobia in Mexico, etc. And one of the things that emerges from these reports is really the similarity in the way that Islamophobia is being expressed. Jasmin reminded me that I was involved in this project in 2017, Countering Islamophobia Toolkit. And it was a study, 6-country study, which looked at 10 dominant themes in the narratives produced in 6 different countries about Islamophobia. And I'm just going to read them out very, very quickly. It's a horrible thing to do later in the day to talk about 10 things, but I promise I won't talk about them. I just want you to think if you're recognizing them. 1, a threat to security. In every single instance, there's always an idea that Islamophobia is Muslims constitute a threat to security. Unassuming, they cannot be integrated into society. Demographic time bomb, that eventually Muslims will overpopulate. Even in a country like the Czech Republic, which has 10,000 Muslims, there are politicians saying that in 20 years' time, it will become 100. It becomes a majority state. They don't tell them, but anyway. So this is in charge. The idea that Islam is theocratic, so it cannot be a Muslim and believe in democracy or any kind of occupation. The threat that Islam and Muslims threaten the identity of society, gender inequality, the idea that there's an ontological difference, that Muslims are just different totally in there. The innate violence, they're prone to violence like no one else is prone to violence. Not that they're provoked, but they are. But somehow they're incomplete citizenship. They're not really proper citizens, even if they have citizens. And we see a kind of a manifestation of that in a way where you have now legislation in many parts of the world, including the European Union, where you basically have a de facto 2-tier citizenship. There are those citizens whose citizenship cannot be revoked by the state. And there are other citizens whose citizenship can be revoked by the state without even a court process. Once you have that, you basically have de facto apartheid. And this is not just happening in sort of East European states, this is happening in the center of the liberal enactment of the sort of post-1945 settlement. Countries like Britain, France, etc., that this is becoming possible. And the final point really is to do with things like, for example, homophobia. You name any discriminatory practice, and you can always justify, we may be bad, but those Muslims, they're worse. And even the most kind of misogynist, patriarchal person can become a feminist when it comes to Muslims. Yeah. So when you see this collection of these themes, and I'll finish very quickly, is that you do see a certain regularity in dispersion. They are regular statements which appear in not interesting combinations, but it is possible to recognize them. So what I would say to you is that what the reports help us to understand, perhaps, is that Islamophobia has a grammar. It's almost become like watching a particular thriller or any kind of thriller on TV. You kind of know, or a detective story. There's a murder, there's a detective. At the end, you know what will happen, right? And it's that kind of rule of the genre that once Islamophobia becomes a status, it actually becomes so everyday. And the risk is that you don't interrupt the means to have that narrative and start internalizing that constantly. So the challenge initially was to get the recognition that these things were happening. And now the challenge is that it's there, but now what we need is a better way of thinking about the future in which we don't have to play the part of being villains in someone else's movie. So I think these reports help in that process by interrupting that narrative and getting us behind the appearance of naturalism, which seems to be the case, that Islamophobia is something becoming so normalized that it will become difficult to speak against it. This is why I think that work is really, really important. Sorry, I think it's over.
Thank you, Dr. Salman. We're just gonna ask the panelists to speak to, or colleagues to speak to some questions we have here, and then we'll open it up for your questions as well. So just wanted to ask what, of course, as I mentioned at the outset, this is kind of painstaking work, risky work, it's underfunded. You're working against an entire industry, of course, of Islamophobia. So what have been some of the challenges you have faced in doing this research? Political, economic, finances, the Islamophobes themselves. So I'll open it up to all of you.
All right. So what are some of the challenges there? A lot of challenges. I mean, first of all, let's start with a serious one. I think in 2014, when we started the European Islamophobia report, basically, I would say up to that point, the vast majority of literature that was produced and research was basically focusing on Western Europe. So the East of Europe was a complete blind spot. And one of the things that we started with intentionally at the very beginning, and that was like, shortly before the so-called refugee crisis, as it was called by White Europe, started in 2015 with refugees coming from Iraq and Syria primarily. We were interested in how that plays out in those regions where you don't have like 5 to 9% of the population being Muslim, like in France or in Austria, but also how that plays out in countries where you have 0.0 something percent Muslims, which is a lot of the Eastern European countries. So bringing in activists, scholars to work on that was a challenge in itself because it was simply something people didn't think about, So it was like, how can we even make sense of the existence of Islamophobia, something that is being neglected, even though we don't have a lot of Muslims today. And I think that everything that happened after 2015 clearly showed us, and you have been following, the news media all around the globe, what happened in Hungary with all the anti-Muslim discourse, etc. So that's like one of the like intellectual kind of challenges at the very beginning. Then obviously in 2014-15, there was a major political challenge because the friend that I talked about, the co-editor, MS Berkeley, who had approached me at that time, was not only working for the German Turkish University, but he was also working for a think tank that is based in Turkey. So when we had designed our report, EU-Turkey relations were still good. But once the first report was out, the relations were deteriorating. So as an application, we were basically framed, and that was a good tool for the Islamophobia industry because they framed us as the long arm of the Turkish Republic, right? Which obviously was not true, but that was a good framing how to basically sideline us and try to not give us any space in the European Parliament. There is, in fact, a decision made during a European Parliament meeting that I should not get any funding from any European institution, and that was introduced by the Christian Democratic Union. Nobody was really taking care because that was part of a financial kind of meeting discussion, but it was a way how they could basically marginalize us, which did not mean that we would not get any sort of funding. We still get funding here and there, but it is a way of, having such kind of decision made in the European Parliament that can be used to put pressure on everybody who could potentially invite us, which did not stop any, all MEPs to work with us, but it was a very useful means. The other thing is that one of the big challenges that came was as much as we had support let's give you an example of one country without naming it explicitly, but a larger, more important European country located in what we would refer to as the west of Europe, was a country that on the one hand you would find state departments that would, on the basis of our knowledge production, would argue, now we have to do something, and they got state funds to work against Islamophobia. And we had in the very same country departments that approached our authors telling them, or like from the Ministry of Interior, telling them, if you continue with that kind of work, you won't get any state funds from any kind of academic institutions. And obviously in Europe, where the welfare state and donation state is much stronger in terms of distributing all kinds of resources in academia, and state universities are much stronger and more important than in a country like the US, that is of relevance. We have authors that were basically whose academic career was destroyed, right? So there is also an interesting tendency, if we look at, let's say, the authors of those, of the respective country reports. In the past, we were interested in having authors that were from the country and were residing in those countries, like me as an Austrian living in Austria, speaking about Austria. We have a tendency that the most horrific anti-Muslim states, most of the authors are now expats living outside because they fear if they draft such a report, they don't have any kind of future and they will be targeted. And that is an increasing problem that we see. And I'm not only speaking about Russia, like where we had many times like authors who would just use a pseudonym because they would fear for their lives, but we have more and more authors from the West rather than from the East, actually, that would fear about their academic or whatever kind of future in order to survive as people. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, and I'm sure there are other things that we can discuss here.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, I've characterized in my report that fighting Islamophobia is like playing the game of whack-a-mole. Remember that carnival game when you were a kid and, this bowl would pop up and you'd hit it with a hammer, and as soon as you did, it would come up over here and you keep hitting it and it would still keep coming up. So that's what it was like working in this report. It was like playing a game of whack-a-mole and never really knowing when you could stop, because there would always be new entities, something popping up that you had to capture. And as Farid has noted, this work is not for the faint of heart. It is going through a lot of very difficult rabbit holes that you have to go into, and a lot of very, difficult kind of dealing with the muck of hate speech and so on. So on the one hand, it has that element to it that it can affect you, someone doing this research on a very personal level, and having to spend hours and hours and years delving into that sort of muckraking. And at the same time, it also, as Farid mentions, it has had personal and political and professional implications. And so, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I had to be very clear about in this report was making sure that everything was very rigorously cited. I had a lawyer provided to me by my university to go through everything line by line to protect me from defamation. And so that process took a very, very long time. Going down a million rabbit holes, archiving 100 pages of cited sources, because you have to make sure that what you're doing is sort of airtight. Not that the other side does any of that or any fact checking, and that's the other challenge of sort of dealing with Islamophobia in a post-truth world, where at the end of the day, a lot of the facts don't matter to people on the other side, anyhow, and they don't need to leverage any facts to gain traction. And so, having that legal oversight, which was on the one hand very important for me, to be able to have this sort of peace of mind and so on, but also very difficult to then, not just do the process of doing research, but to have to really get into nitty-gritty things, be careful about how you're saying things, how you're characterizing things, and so on. That was a very, academic freedom covers you only to a certain point. And we have to protect ourselves in other ways in doing this kind of research. It also affected me in the process of doing the research. I went to a conference, one of the soft power groups in the Islamic industry in Canada, really with some graduate students. We were kind of incognito, just documenting what was being said. And there were different concurrent sessions, and I was alone in a session, a security briefing session. They took our phones. And I actually questioned one of the speakers because I got to a point, I told my grad students, don't say anything, we're flies on the wall, don't speak, just make notes. But I didn't follow that rule myself. Because I have to say, at this security briefing, one of the speakers, who was someone in the Islamophobia industry that I've been monitoring for a while, this was 3 days, by the way, after the New Zealand terror attack. So that happened on a Friday, this was a Sunday, this conference happened. And, while they acknowledged it at the beginning of the conference, they then had a moment of silence, not for the victims, but for free speech. That was the moment of silence. And in this so-called security panel, they kept talking about the mosques where the attacks happened as known sites of radicalization. And it was about the third time that that term was used and bantered about by the panelists that I felt I needed to intervene. One of the speakers had been speaking in Iceland. She was invited by a white nationalist group, along with Robert Spencer, to warn Icelanders about Muslims, because there's such a huge Muslim population there. And she said, she used the notion of taqiyya, that Muslims are wolves in sheep's clothing. And she said, they may smile at you, they may be friendly, they may invite you to their homes, but don't believe them, because they're here to take over you, your country, and your land. And so I questioned her about this first, very much just sort of like, oh, so what's your message for Canadians? This was your message for Icelanders. And then I think she clued into the fact that that was not an actual question, but I had an agenda at that point. So this started a bit of back and forth, and the moderator told me I was trespassing at that point. So I got up to leave, but I turned to her and I said, your rhetoric is the kind of rhetoric that inspired the shooter in New Zealand. It's that same kind of rhetoric. At that point, it caused a commotion. Someone came over, a man grabbed and twisted my arm, pulled me out of the room. Somebody else shouted, well, you're just lucky to be in this country in the first place. So, that was some of, it's nothing compared to what, people like Farid and others have experienced for doing Islamophobia work. But that was in the course of doing this research, and that shows the different kinds of risks that we open ourselves up to, beyond just the hate speech or the hate mail, having campaigns where people will go after donors to the university, threatening to pull out if they continue to support you and all of this sort of thing, as well as going to your funders and trying to undermine you in that way. And actually that happened to me with my first partner on this project, which was the National Council of Community Muslims, who should have been supporting me and supporting this research, but then turned around when backlash started happening and backed away from me and backed out of the project and wrote to my funders to say that they no longer supported it. And so that was a difficult time, but I'm very grateful to Hafez and to the Islamophobia Studies Center, the IRTP, for stepping in and taking over as project partners. And I have to give a shout out to Hanny, who did the work on the graphic design of this report. So it was great to find the solidarity and support elsewhere when I wasn't able to find it in my own community. So it was difficult being attacked by white nationalists, by pro-Israel fringe right group, by every sector of the Islamophobia industry, and then being thrown under the bus by an organization in your own community. So often when you do this work, you are a city duck, and you are subject to a lot of different kinds of confrontation. And so those are, I think some of the challenges, both on a personal level, professional, and political level, that might be the territory of this project.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really don't have
any personal risk I face doing this research. To be honest, I know about the risk my colleague takes, but the challenges that we face, let me step back. Any research within against system of covering Islamism, period, is just not easy. Because the one of to prove something that is not necessarily guided by a visual actor is the most difficult thing to do as a social scientist. We try to prove something that there's not even consensus among ourselves as Muslims Americans. But so the challenges I face, first of all, we need to define Islamophobia in a very simple terms. So we all understand what is it, what it means, how we do it. The other challenge was related to our study, actually, the fear inhabited within Muslim communities themselves to participate. I cannot tell you, without many people in this room, and some people even outside the United States, I contacted Saul in Japan in order to provide me with some Muslim here. I could like to participate in a survey. That's how far we went. We went to the 5 corners of the world in order to just send survey to Muslims, Americans. And I came from an institute that I'm very well protected within that institute, offering and growing, protected to do Islamophobia research. So I cannot speak to any risk I took professionally, but personally it might be, but I'm less concerned about that. But the amount of fear of the subjects themselves to participate, that's really will undermine our work itself. It's not that easy to send an online survey to a Muslim to ask them about all this stuff. It's really, really hard. We have to go like any other well-established survey to go through a process, and we wanted to make sure that we cannot even have access to the IP addresses of the people who participate in the survey. To that extent, just like Jasmin, she went through a lawyer, but also we have a lawyer to check every single word when we drafted the drafts. Not when we send, even the question, we want to make sure that we don't ask a question that would jeopardize the safety of the subject themselves. So this kind of the challenges and risks that we take does, of course, hinder you from having access to the subject for the study. However, if you want to have access, and there is a couple of places here in the United States, maybe 2 or 3, they have large amount of Muslim database. When I asked, they told me is that the estimate about 600,000 Muslims. At the end of the day, of course, I didn't have 600,000 to do it. I did it with less than $3,000, right? So, but we have to go through a whole year of contacting people. We contacted every single Muslim association in the United States, every single one of them. That's for 2 people. The support of people like Elsadig here. Some students supported us just to send emails. It took longer amount of time than any other survey we did. But the result was amazing. And the idea was to break through the field itself. Like how, as a Muslim, you could actually say what is it. And you could find support within the idea that you are not alone. And that's the reason why we conducted it. And we refuse any non-Muslim to participate. Not because we are better than anyone, but we want the voices of those people to speak to these questions so they can formulate a baseline. So tomorrow when the next generation of researchers come along, they can build on this and fill the gaps that we left behind. It's not a perfect survey at all, but it's a fair survey in the United States by Muslims to speak only to Muslim Americans and to discuss all Islamophobia in the context of hyper-secularization of this country.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very significant. Think about again the history that's out there and what we're up against. I'm going to combine these two, and we've spoken to a little bit of this, so there's enough time for colleagues in the audience to also ask questions. What were some of the gaps in the research, and I'm also thinking to extend this with thinking about the report as a certain kind of work, right? Even within academia and how it's used in public policy circles and whatnot, as in comparison to, for example, Dalia's work or others who speaks for Salman. I mean, there's these two different kinds of things. So, how do you think that some of the gaps in research are filled by reports? And then also, how has this been received? I mean, we know how the Islamophobia industry receives these, but how are these reports received within and outside the academy?
Oh, I guess, I just want to add one thing to that question you said about how the reports work. I think there are two things. One is that in general, the academy makes a big case, especially in some places now, to be relevant to society. So in a way, this kind of public engagement, this kind of work should actually be really, really significant. In some jurisdictions, they have this as a kind of a criteria, what we call academic impact, and it's really very, very significant from that point of view. However, the problem with engaging with society through reports, and I think this is what you pointed out, is that it's not risk-free. And while different universities have different degrees of robustness in defending the production of knowledge which may be critical or difficult, there is a particular challenge to do with Islamophobia, and I think it's to do with the fact that most universities tend to be populated by those who consider themselves to be probably left of center, in which case they consider themselves to be immune to racism, and certainly also believe that religion is something that really shouldn't be involved anywhere. And I think one of the biggest problems with Islamophobia is that it's not just an effect of the right. We're quite often used to racism from the right. The Islamophobia also exists quite on the left. And I'll just give you one small example of this. The Countering Islamophobia toolkit that I just referred to earlier on was funded by the European Union. And so it was a legitimate process, and went through bidding, etc. And what happened is this: when the reports come out, a left-wing German MP complained to the European Union that this report was radical, etc., etc. And the European Union then decided to withdraw the funding after the funds had been spent. The university decided that it couldn't contest that, so it had to basically return the money there. And what happens, and it sort of paid up basically with the money that had been spent. But I think what that illustrates is the fact that the challenge for Islamophobia doesn't just come from one end of the spectrum. And it's important that we recognize the full range, that Islamophobia is one of those things that actually unite the Eurocentrism of the right with the Eurocentrism of the left. And that I think is very, very difficult. So I think the impact that reports like this have, the problem is that there isn't a constituency right now existing looking for those reports to be implemented into policy. We haven't got that kind of leverage in that way. And often the reports can also become a way of actually deflecting. If you don't want to do something about something, then have a report about it sometimes. And I think the main function of the reports, and I think Sayyid mentioned this, is really about bearing witness. And I think that itself is not insignificant, but the reports really should be seen as agents for mobilizing populations rather than implementing policy changes, because the policy changes will not come without that mobilization.
Let me connect to that. I don't know if I fully agree. I mean, I think in terms of the capacity that you are building for social mobilization. I think that's absolutely valid. But, you know, I'm thinking about, I remember when we started that process, and since we addressed very specifically the policy makers also in terms of the recommendation that we were formulating. I mean, I'm just thinking about like Germany introducing the category of anti-Muslim hate crime as a specific hate crime category within the hate crime monitoring within the police apparatus. And several other things that happened, and obviously, I mean, there is no smoking gun evidence that this was due to our report, but I think there is a certain kind of pressure that you are creating even in these policy circles. And I mean, you know, the other example would be like the European Commission coordinating on anti-Muslim hate crime. I mean, there is, I think, one interesting, you know, at least that's our vision, and we try to implement that as much as possible. Because the report that we produce, I mean, I don't believe, as correctly says, so a lot of these reports, they are not read. They are not even designed for being read. Who wants to read a 900-page report, right? We don't produce this kind of document, but we rather see it as a resource that if you are a scholar and you're looking at specific dots that you want to connect with each other and trying to see a bigger picture and analyze, that's what you do, right? You have that kind of resource that you produce to help other people. And I mean, I think that's also something that one of the few things that we can quantify, because if you go on Google Scholar, you can see how many people quote that reports, right? So you can see, okay, that is of relevance for the scholarly audience. But then also, let's say, the European Commission coordinated on anti-Muslim hate crime. I remember like this position was voiced for 1.5 years. And usually when we do our recommendations for us as editors for the European perspective, but also we ask our single authors to do that on the basis of their national reports, is to be in a strong relationship with the Muslim community and the anti-racist organizations and the monitoring bodies. Non-governmental as much as governmental. Why? Because a lot of the work that, say, institutions like the European Network Against Racism and others do, we want to support it and we want to be supported, right? So pushing and regularly criticizing, and you know that kind of critique also being covered then in media audiences, that creates a pressure on policymakers. So the fact that we now have not only again being reinstated, and I'm not talking about the value of the position itself of the EU coordinator on anti-Muslim hate crime, but also that even the title was expanded to EU coordinator on anti-Muslim hate crime and discrimination, which has like more of a structural component being included. All of that was part and parcel of a year-long, campaign by us and many other civil society organizations that were pushing into that direction. So, yeah, I think that is something that where we can also see, without having the smoking gun evidence, but we see that there are fruits coming out of that kind of pressure that we also create vis-a-vis those institutions.
I disagree, Farid, you disagree.
Also fine.
I think in terms of gaps, I thought about it 2 ways. First of all, I would say that what a gap this study filled was that it was the first one to look at Islamophobia in the streets in Canada. All of research has been done in the United States. So it was important to do that again, to work against these sort of Canadian multicultural exceptionalism and the idea of Canada's now immune from these particular kinds of formations of hate groups. And so that was, I think, an area that this report filled the gap. And I think also the report filled gaps within, the field of looking at these particular kinds of networks. In that we were able to, in comparison to US studies, which was more foundational and really important, and especially we're very instructive around the money that circulates within the Islamophobia industry, which I think the last report hijacked by HYCare showed that there was about $1.5 billion that circulates through 39 groups within the US. And we were able to show how certain US groups had ties to Canadians. We know, for example, the conference that I went to that I just spoke about where I was physically assaulted was actually funded by Leeds Forum. We know that there are ties with Salman Foundation, with Aidstone, the Laurier Fund. So we were able to show transnational linkages as well, and I think that's important to look at. We were also able to show links between some Canadian players and their involvement in, the campaign against migrants coming in from Africa into Europe, and the Sea Star, which was the boat that was, put together by Mark Selner and Generation Identity, also had the backing of Canadian and Southern. And so we've been able to sort of look at the transnational ties that these groups are building, and I think more work has to be done in terms of looking at the global linkages. So I think that was important in adding another layer to further understanding the transnationality of Islamophobia networks. I think we also were able to talk about the role of white nationalist groups within this constellation, and they did figure into the US studies. So our report did look at the role of white nationalist groups, and we also were able to, under each group we profiled, or each individual, break down their ideas, their ideologies that they were promoting. And one chapter dealt specifically with those conspiracy theories and discourses and what I call Islamophobia's playlist, and really looked at all the different, there were many, but the tropes, the conspiracies, the Islamist boogeyman being one of the biggest ones, the Trojan horse that we call them, the demographic replacement, civilizational jihad, taqiyya, Sharia, all of these ideas. The way Quran was weaponized, right? The weaponizing of the Quran is another part of the toolkit that's used by these groups. And so I think it was important to kind of, provide that genealogy of some of those different tropes and narratives and conspiracy theories, and then be able to look at how they were being leveraged by the different groups and individuals and influencers that we profiled. So we could then sort of see some patterns emerging there. So that was something I think that the report, offered by way of filling gaps in the research that I think needed to be filled. And as far as the reception of the report, I mean, the Islamophobia industry receives it in one way. In fact, there was an article in the National Post not long ago about the report, pretty much trashing the report. That the headline was, "Another Israel super critic gets funding from the federal government." So that's me, apparently. And so there was really taking aim at the fact that I was getting funding for this research. And as a kind of show of solidarity to try and support me, the Canadian Jewish Faculty Network wrote a letter of support for my report, which they sent to my funders, which they sent to my university, categorically stating that this report was not anti-Semitic, because they know what anti-Semitism is, and this wasn't it, and providing a lot of praise for the report and for the work that I was doing. And that solidarity mattered a lot on an affective level, but as well on a professional level. And so, that was, I think, important as well, because so much of this is to really undercut you, make sure you get no money and support, right? And we get so little in comparison to the amount of money that is mobilized by anti-Muslim groups, right? This is a David and Goliath kind of battle. But I just want to add a couple of important ways that the report has been performing, I think, good political work, has been the fact that it's been provided as evidence in 2 legal cases since the fall. And one was a human rights case where someone who worked for a university as a contract faculty in Canada lost their job because of a campaign by the Islamophobia industry to undermine them. They had given a khutbah and were accused of being anti-Semitic. And it was actually the tape that was used had been spliced and diced and mistranslated, and there was a former IDF soldier behind this. And there were all kinds of collusions between different groups in the Islamophobia industry to undermine this person's employment. And so the report was entered into, was brought into that case, and I was an expert witness in testimony. And then more recently in a defamation case, the report was entered into evidence there as well. This was a defamation suit against an Islamophobia industry player in Canada who had accused Islamic Relief Canada, a charitable organization, of being a front for the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, and had written many, many reports on it. And so they decided to sue for defamation. And so I was able to provide some expert witness testimony around the role of the Islamophobia industry and the backdrop of Islamophobia in Canada and the networks and so on. So I think that was important. And then finally, I was asked to testify in the Senate. So the Canadian Senate has been having hearings on Islamophobia for the last, actually, I think 2 years now. And so I was invited back specifically to speak about this report in the Senate. But then interestingly, 2 weeks later, a pro-Israel fringe right group in Canada that's known to be quite Islamophobic in their rhetoric and activities, Fanatic Breath, actually appeared at the Senate hearings on Islamophobia and spent their 5 minutes trying to trash my report and then talk about why Islamophobia is a bogus term and we should just call it anti-Muslim. So again, they don't let you get the last word. And so there's always attempts, no matter what, it's that game of whack-a-mole. Whenever we try and hit one manifestation, they come up with another. So it's a never-ending kind of battle.
I will be brief. In terms of gaps, I think I spoke to that. And our intention with that actually to establish a baseline of how we can measure those things. Because at the end of the day, when we all, and people here in the room know that more than I do, when you talk about those phenomena, oftentimes, we need them to be nationalized. Our goal was how we look at Islamophobia within into the system of prejudice, bias, and outright discrimination. So in order to do that, we have to establish a data-driven evidence to support those claims. And the second large gap, I think, was the amount of requests we received from PhD students, especially Muslim students, that they wanted it to do something similar or smaller or to fill the gaps. And that's what's very easy to any researcher if you know that somebody actually see a value in the work you did. Because that's what the intention too. The intention is how we populate beyond, I'm not against narrative or personal narratives, but I'm not concerned about that, honestly. My concern is one system. If a system doesn't work, my personal narrative is not going to change policy. But we need to hit the system in its information itself, because that's where everything else in that system. And it should look benign, but in reality, it's built to discriminate against you. And Muslim is one of other group of vast group of people, especially in the context of North America. Since the genocide against indigenous people of this land, African American, Chinese exclusionary act. The list is long, and it's not going to stop with Muslims because it's a system. So how we challenge the system, all use data driven. Other two things I will speak about in terms of perceptions. So as I stated in the beginning, our focus was how to monitor the government of the United States. The idea is to get away with all the federal measures that discriminate against Muslims. I mean, there's a lot of them there. And oftentimes it's very hard to work through. So the idea was to put pressure where the United States feel ashamed, which is the international forum. So we publish every year, I've been trained in a human rights mechanism. So what I do, I try to use the same international treaties that you sign off on as a government, any government, and I hold you accountable. So we publish smaller reports only targeted the Berkeley periodic of the United States, happening every 5 years, the social and economic rights, and also we find the desperate impact of something. So what is the desperate impact of Islamophobia in perpetuating racism in the United States? So we prove that through legal means, through documentation, and we call out about our government to remedy this because she can do it. And there's other body that we did it, which is Congress. So we wanted to provide those, to fill those gaps. So we work as if we work from two sides. One side from outside, international body, inside is our policymakers. So in that we supply the UN envoy, United States that examining racial profiling in the United States, those documents, and he will come and meet with us here, Berkeley, and somewhere else, so we provide them with evidence in order to do solid investigation based on evidence, based on this personal narratives. And the second thing, our report was cited is two documents that's been able to allow Representative Omar to suggest to the State Department that the State Department should have an international envoy on Islamophobia. The one was the UN envoy, and the second one was other than report. Because this is solid evidence. You cannot escape this. This is not my personal opinion or analysis in a book. This is not anecdotal evidence. This is widespread systematic attempt by legal, social, cultural, and political institutions in this country. So, and I think that's one of the good reception we received. But I cannot finish without saying this. The most pleasing thing and painful when we did the survey is to discover that there is so much gaps in the Islamophobia research. It needs to be supported. In particular, in public health, psychological impact on Muslims themselves. And the third and the most terrifying one, the impact on underage people of Muslim descent. This is insane. If you know that almost 90% of Muslims being surveyed said they try to hide their identity in order to avoid any punish. I mean, a lot of them are, all of them are adult because we only survey about 18, right? So I asked myself, how about under 18? Because all of those above 18, they were once under 18 when the bully started. So this is called for all of you. If you want to fill it up, don't look at foreign policy. Don't look at security. We have plenty of this. Don't look at civilization. Look at those particular gaps that really need our support our communities and to enrich the academia and also to translate the academic gap into community so community could be equipped better to fight and to combat Islam.
Thank you so much. That was really profound, and please let's all look at these reports. I use them in my classes, and there are so many people here who have worked on various reports as well, Hafez and Corey and the care reports. So these do have impact, even though we don't see them at this kind of large scale level, but they are meaningful, and we appreciate the risks, of course, involved in you doing this work. So in the few minutes we have, we just wanted to open up for any questions, and also have them. You might want to
just maybe a start on the work where, in terms of Muslims reporting, which is another finding that overwhelming majority of Muslims don't report on their cases of Islamophobia, which means that whatever data we get is literally represent only 10% of those who are facing Islamophobia. And then when we get to the state, to the FBI hate crime reporting, it also gives us a slice of the 10% because 87% of police departments nationally don't report hate crimes because they don't have a legislation. So what we're getting is a very small layer of data and experiences of Muslims to try to get a very good set of data about what is taking place on the ground. So that's something that we still need to figure out in terms of our gap in research. The second, which is, I think, for all of us in terms of academia, the absence of allies institutionally that would possibly come out into other areas of research, but when it comes to Muslims, they want to come to greet you, but they don't want to hug you. So there is what I call inclusion by means of exclusion. So there you will find, again, the posters of the Muslim woman in hijab are so prominent in different campuses, but there is a structural exclusion. And so much so that often almost the Islamophobe's voice resonates institutionally as it relates to Muslims. So how to deal with that serious aspect in terms of the Islamophobia research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you want to do it. No, absolutely. I think that's you hit the nail on the head. One of the findings from our report that most people that identify that they experience personally Islamophobic incidents, over 2/3 of them, they said, one, they did not report it, and the second question, we asked why. The two answers were either I don't know where, or I didn't want to. So, and that's when I started the beginning. I said, this is the sad discovery that the fear inhabited for subject themselves is not accidental. It's not people want to be inhabited by fear, but because of the system. You're absolutely right. And our role is, by doing such work, we try to normalize that you can talk about it, you can report it. And having Badiana with this project, one of the amazing things I do that to make it much easier to report these incidents through a mobile app. But we have long way ahead. Other people who experience maybe less than us. I don't want to compare our pain with their pain or something like that, but they are capable of catching every single incident. And that's very important. Sometimes we don't even know if that incident was in some form. And that's terrifying too. So you're absolutely right. I mean, and we get questions, even with reporting, when we did this work. They ask us all sorts of questions in terms of funding. I refused. I said, no, you can't question the integrity of the research. This is the research question, and you have to. But they said, we're worried about the reporting aspect. That's basically what they said. I didn't even start it yet. I'm asking you for money, and you tell me about the end result. I said, no, you don't have no right to actually say anything. This is based on the subject, how they feel. If they feel threatened, if they feel this is Islamophobic incidents, I have to believe them. I have no way of investigating their hearts. So the call for all of us is we have to invite our communities to be able to report, to find venues, whether those venues are state-run agencies or our own community centers that we populate. So we understand actually the scale of the problem. And finally, I will say this, in doing work within Islamophobia, the scale is terrifying. So people don't know the scale of the fear. Like if 90% of women, and by the way, participant was equally almost men to women, is 2% non-defined with a gender, but like 49% were women. I mean, 90% of them, they said, they fear of even declaring their own identity. And of those, was 76% born and raised in the United States. So they are Americans, period. And 35% of the people we surveyed was from California, so the most progressive place, just like to support what Salman says, is really that's the truth. Even within progressive spaces, people are afraid. But where does that fear come? Because, you know, the trauma transcends through generations, right? Like all this trauma we inhabited within our households. So how we disengage that, that's the work of all of us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to continue on this thread. You said something profound earlier. You said about Obama, they couldn't call him N-word, so they called him M-word. And what I discern from that is something that I see experientially, is there is an ontological hierarchy embedded. And so people are more willing to express anti-racism, and they don't think that suffices to report on the racism, but they're afraid to report on Islamophobia. I found this also, there was a longitudinal study going across 13 countries, but nothing was done in the Middle East. It was on digital expression. So I applied and I got the grant from London School of Economics, the Middle Eastern Center. They gave us $250,000, it's a good amount of money. I was ancillarily trying to understand the same question of when they face anti-Muslim rhetoric, Islamophobic rhetoric digitally, what do they do? And I found the same thing that you found, which is most of them don't want to deal with it. It's not that they don't know where to report. There really is no recourse for them. Okay, we're talking about, this is the first study in the Arab world, specifically in Kuwait, and the study design is very complicated because it's in 4 languages. But I wanted to follow up on the methodology that you're using because you're putting together a corpus of data that scholars will build upon for years, and you're probably underfunded, and you're facing self-harm and all of these issues. Is there any type of way that you can follow up with the methodology of this question? Number 2, you said they don't want to. Yes, they're internalizing. Is there anything that can incentivize people, and that can help us develop better methodologies?
I would love other people to answer, but I will take the shot at it. You know, it's sad, but one of the ways in which we think that we would deal with this type of inviting people to come out and to say it takes time. So we try to build the narrative itself. So I come from a place that's power conceived nothing without a demand. You know, it is not going to work, whether that's research or policy proposals or reform. So I think to invite Muslim American in particular to come out and to report what they think, even if it's little act of microaggression, because that's how it started. You know, I don't usually face Islamophobic attack, most likely I face outright anti-black which I don't know which one is best, but it's difficult because obvious, because I carry it in my face. But I imagine if I'm a female black, what do I would face and how to disentangle the two? And sometimes we did a focus group to answer that question here, and all of them was female, to just figure out the next way to deal with the methodology to ask. And to disentangle what the focus group told us is beyond belief. Like, we need 10 surveys in order to deal with the same question, to drag the information out of people. Sometimes traumatized subjects themselves, the line became blurry for them, which one is which. But I think that the way in which Hatim's project here online, it will provide us with that kind of first-hand evidence in digital formation, and we could follow. We have to start localizing those evidence before we go even beyond the nation. We need to localize it in California or in the Bay Area or in Kansas. We receive some kind of terrifying testimony because at the end of the survey we allow people to have it. Kind of testimony is really breaks your heart, but none of them from major reputable type. It's a real dilemma. Yeah.
Okay, I think just join me in thanking our colleagues again.
Thank you. So tomorrow we'll start again for those who will start early in the morning, and hopefully we'll see everybody here tomorrow. Thank you.